Good afternoon. We are talking about of punctuation in relative clause is in two different clauses, the defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause. Veremos cláusulas relativas definidas y cláusulas relativas no definidas en inglés. The first part is the defining relative clauses. We use defining relative clauses to give essential information about someone or something. Information that we need in order to understand what or who is being referred to. A defining relative clause usually comes immediately after the noun it describes. We usually use a relative pronoun, for example, who, that, which, whose, and whom. To introduce a defining relative clause. In the example, the relative clause is involved and the person of the thing being referred to is underlined. For example, they are the people who want to buy our house. Here are some cells which have been affected. They should give the money to somebody who they think needs the treatment most. Talking about an actress. She's now playing a woman whose son was killed in the First World War. Spoken English. In defining relative clause, we often use that instead of who, whom, or which. This is very common in informal speaking. For example, there are people that want to buy our house. Here are some cells that have been affected. No relative pronoun. We often leave out of the relative pronoun when it's the object of the verb. For example, they are the people she met at John's party. Here are some cells that researcher has identified. Subject or object. The relative pronoun can define the subject of the object of the verb. For example, they are the people who or that bought the house. The people bought her house. So, the people is the subject. They are the people who or that she met John's party. She met the people. The people now is the object. Here are some cells which or that show abnormality. Some cells show abnormality. So, some cells is the subject. Here are some cells which or that the researcher has identified. The researcher has identified some cells. So, some cell is the object. Warning. In writing, we don't use commas in defining relative clause. This is a man who takes his responsibility seriously. Don't do it. This is a man who takes his responsibility seriously because it's so a bad grammar. Nouns are pronouns in relative clause. When the relative pronoun is the subject or the relative clause, we don't use another personal pronoun or noun in the relative clause because the subject underlined is the same. She is the lady who lent me her phone, who is the subject of the relative clause, so we don't need the personal pronoun she. There are now only 2 schools in the area that actually teach Latin. That is the subject of the relative clause, so we don't need the personal pronoun they. When the relative pronoun is the object of the relative clause, we don't use another personal pronoun or noun at the relative clause because the object underlined is the same. We had a lovely meal at the place which Peel recommend, which is the object in the relative clause, so we don't need the personal pronoun it. The next is non-definite relative clause. We use non-definite relative clause to give extra information about the person or thing. It is not necessary information. We don't need to understand who or what is being referred. We always use the relative pronoun who, which, whose, or whom. To introduce a non-definite relative clause in the examples, relative clause is involved and the person or thing being referred in the underline. For example, Claire, who I work with, is doing the London Marathon this year. Claire, I work with, is doing the London Marathon in this year. This is incorrect. Doctors use the testing kit for regular screening for lung and stomach cancers, which account for 70% of cancers treated in the Western world. Alice, who has worked in Brussels and London ever since leaving Edinburgh, will be starting a teaching course in the autumn. Warning: we don't use that to introduce a non-definite relative clause. For example, Allen, who scored 3 goals in the first game, was the only player to perform well. It's correct. But the incorrect word is Allen that scored 3 goals in the first game was the only player to perform well, because the word that will be not in not definite clause. In punctuation, in writing, we use commas and wrong non-definite relative clause. For example, at the right, whose English born with Irish parents replaced Neil Francis, whose injury forced him to withdraw last week. Spoken English. In speaking, we often pause at the beginning and the end of the clause. For example, unlike American film, we typically supply a 3 big American car makers, Japanese ones traditionally work exclusively with one maker. It's formal, and the informal is and this woman, who I'd never met before, came up and spoke to me. In the comparison difference, sometimes defining and non-defining relative clause can look very similar but have different meanings. And the defining, his brother, who works at the supermarket, is a friend of mine. He has more than one brother. The one I'm talking about works at the supermarket. It's hoped that we will raise £10,000 for local charities which help the homeless. The money is intended for local charities. Some of these local charities help the homeless. There are other local charities as well as this. And the non-definite, his brother, who works at the supermarket, is a friend of mine. He has only one brother, and that brother works at the supermarket. It is hoped that will be raised £2,000 for local charities which help the homeless. The money is intended for local charities, and those local charities help the homeless. Warning: the information is a definite relative clause is essential, so we can leave out the relative clause. The information in a non-definite relative clause is extra information, which isn't essential, so we can leave out the relative clause. This is for all, and thank you so much for watching my video, and see you in the next video.